I just got back from doing my initial demo of Apple Vision Pro, and I wanted to give you some of my candid initial thoughts. It's definitely going to be a little bit more off the cuff and unplanned compared to what you're probably used to from me, but I think the initial experience is an interesting one, and I want to get a lot of these ideas out of my head before I forget what it was like actually using the device. As far as the process to demo it, actually pretty straightforward. You go there, you ask for a demo, they give you a time to come back. I think I got there at open at 8 o'clock. They were able to get me in at 9 a.m. or they planned to get me in at 9 a.m. I think someone actually came and sat me down at 9:17, and then they weren't able to actually get a device ready for me until about 9:45, which is actually way better than I was expecting. I was expecting to be there all day, if we're being honest. As far as the demo itself goes, I think it's about as scripted as you would expect from Apple. It's optimized for a user who's done no research. And as someone like myself who's done probably way too much research on this, it's a lot to sit through. So let's get into what the device itself is like. It is a beautiful set of ski goggles, a very heavy, very beautiful set of ski goggles. When I did my initial pre-order, I did a scan of my face and it gave me one size. I didn't end up pulling the trigger on that pre-order. And then later that day, I did another pre-order to see if a different SKU was available. I got two different size fittings for the light seal. And so I mentioned that to the folks at Apple when they asked me if I had a fitting. And so they did a third fitting while I was there, and I got yet another value for the size of my light seal. So my recommendation would be definitely go into the store and try it. When you go to buy it, don't try and do it from your phone because it might not feel right. On that note, it never really felt right for me ever. The band itself sits really high, or at least it had to sit really high for me to try and balance out the weight from my forehead to my cheeks. Typically in a VR headset, all of the weight rests on my cheeks, and this was actually quite the opposite. It all rested on my forehead, but it felt like it wasn't really balanced between the two. Definitely do a fit test because I think a different light seal probably would have been better for me. As far as the initial impressions once you're actually in the headset, it definitely feels like you're looking through a set of binoculars. The peripheral view isn't there at all. It's hard to explain this. So like if you're used to looking out with this much of your eyesight, the Apple Vision Pro is more like this much of your eyesight. There's definitely some vignetting, heavy black vignetting that you'll notice if you use your peripheral vision at all. Just be prepared. I guess maybe that's a bit of a commentary on the Apple Vision Pro in general. I have plenty of experience with VR headsets. There's plenty of trade-offs with VR headsets in general. I guess in my head, I expected an Apple VR headset to get rid of a lot of those limitations. We've been talking a lot about the display density. And I think in my head, I expected them to fix a lot of these issues. And a lot of them are still there. With that said, screen door, not an issue at all. Like the display density is fantastic. That aspect of it is really good. Peripheral vision, not good. And then the other thing I noticed when I first used the device is just the pass-through cameras. The displays themselves are amazing, and the pass-through cameras really don't do them justice. They're noisy and grainy, even in like a reasonably well-lit environment. I would consider Apple stores fairly well lit. Like I would expect that most people's homes are probably much less lit than an Apple store, and it was a very grainy image that was distracting. Also, it felt a little low contrast and low saturation. Like I saw the guy sitting in front of me, and then I was looking at the guy sitting in front of me through Apple Vision, and it felt like pass-through. I always thought that Meta's pass-through on the Quest and the Quest 2 was pretty terrible. And I expected Apple to really up this because the displays are capable of it. My guess is there's some technical limitation with the processing and the latency. They optimized for latency instead of quality with the pass-through cameras that they chose. But for a device that you're constantly seeing your external environment, it definitely distracted for me. With that said, once you actually get into the software experience, I think it was actually really good. The software felt way more polished, in my opinion, than the hardware, which is actually the opposite of how I normally feel about an Apple product. Usually the hardware is incredibly well tuned and well figured out, and then the software is a bit hesitant, where there were some things that they could have done and you wish they would have done, but they didn't because they had too much restraint. Not that the Vision OS doesn't have restraint, it has a ton of restraint, but what they have done feels really polished, and I really quite enjoyed. The only real issue I ran into is the little handles that you use to grab the applications. They don't have a drop shadow of any kinds. At one point I layered a window over another window and I couldn't see the grab handle to move it. because it was white on white. So that's probably something they'll fix in software, I would guess. But overall, the experience of moving around applications was awesome. The big killer app that everyone's been talking about is photos and video that are taken and that you can watch back on Apple Vision Pro. I think the panoramas were cool, but when they're that large, it's very clear that it's just an image. Like, you're watching this big glacier in Iceland, I believe it was. And it's very clear that you're looking at an image. And so my guess is that's probably a camera limitation thing. Again, I'm way more sensitive to this than most people, but you're never going to suspend disbelief of reality to think that you're actually there. It's grand, it's awesome, but I wouldn't call it truly immersive. And that's probably how I feel a bit about spatial video as well. I watched a mother and her daughter blowing out a birthday cake, and it was cool. It was a great experience, but I wouldn't say it felt like I was there. And there's just sort of this general noise and grain. I'm sure we'll fix this with time, but again, it's not going to make you believe you were there. It's way more immersive than a current photo or video. But again, I think expectations have to be dropped just a little bit on the current hardware. When it comes to multitasking and having lots of different apps, at least in the demo, I didn't bump up against any of the limitations that you might run into. I think at one point I had 3 or 4 apps open and I could move them around. There were no real issues. The OS itself seems like it's got more than enough horsepower to run everything that you're doing here, and that felt good. But that said, I did have to stay stationary. They wouldn't let me move for this, but that was one of the first things I wanted to try, is walking around a window, maybe looking at the back of it, but you don't get to do that in the Apple Store. I suppose I could have brought one home to really test it out, but I just don't see myself keeping the device. And so it feels a little bit disingenuous to buy it just to return it. One of the more interesting aspects of the demo was this concept of live events and live sports. There was a concert with Alicia Keys where you're at eye level with her and she's basically singing directly to you, which was really cool. It's a different experience that I think any of us have had. It's a little bit of a different dynamic though. You realize that these people are just people, and I'm curious what that does to the experience with musical artists and things like that. People that are quote unquote larger than life. How this changes the dynamic. The opposite of that is they had a soccer match where you're above the goal and you see during the game a striker hit the post and then it comes back and then they score it. And that was a very different perspective than you typically get. I think live sports and live concerts will be really interesting at some point in the future here. Just a completely different perspective than you can get now. With that said, it's not really spatial computing in that regard. That is really just VR and what we can already do with VR. But I'm still excited to see what Apple can do with it. I want to close with a bit of social commentary, which is they showed these inherently social experiences in the demo. You're looking at photos, you're looking at video, but at the end of the day, being in the headset itself feels a bit cold and a bit lonely. I know a bunch of people have commented about this on YouTube, but you definitely feel it firsthand. It definitely didn't feel like I was there in any of those photos, and you feel a bit alone while there. I am not someone who naturally feels alone. I have a wife and a family, and I feel like I'm generally in a good mental space with regards to that, but I left the headset feeling a little bit disconnected. And I'm a little bit nervous about what the future will look like if this is fully adopted and this is a common thing that we experience. I'm curious to hear your opinion on this after you get a chance to try it and whether you felt something similar. Selecting with your eyes is really interesting, and the gesture of pinching to select things and move things feels really good. I will say the eye tracking isn't quite as fast as I saw it in my head. If I try and move as quickly as I naturally want to, I often get some missed selections. I'm sure they'll refine that with time, but you do have to be a bit more intentional with your gaze than you might think. I'll be looking at things and then select the thing next to it, or if I just go too fast, that'll often happen. Just be aware it's not a fully uninterrupted process. You have to stop and think a little bit. Not a large pause, but there is a pause that you need to take into account. In conclusion, the Apple Vision Pro is interesting. You can definitely see a vision from Apple on what the future will look like, but the current hardware just really isn't there. The weight of the device and how it's distributed is a constant distraction. And even during a 20-minute demo, I never really could ignore it to really get fully immersed in the situation. Software is actually way ahead of schedule. And I think with a few hardware revisions, there's something interesting here. But for me personally, I have a hard time justifying the $3,500, knowing that a Vision Pro 2 will likely solve most of these issues and make for a much more well-rounded device. I think if you're a tech enthusiast and you have to have the latest and greatest thing, or you're an engineer who's looking to get in on the ground floor, before a mass audience is there, then there's maybe something here. But I'd say for most people, we're still probably 1 or 2 versions out from something that's truly compelling that you would use every day. With that said, I think it's something everyone should demo and make up their own mind about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts after doing a demo down in the comments below. If you're new around here on this channel, I share tips and tools to improve your focus and thinking. Subscribe so that you don't miss out on future videos. And if you want to improve your focus, I highly recommend you check out Weekly Reset, which is my weekly email newsletter where I reflect on the past week to share one thought and one tip to improve your focus and creativity. There's a link in the description below where you can subscribe completely for free, and I look forward to seeing you there. And until next time, cheers.